drawn but not enthused, discharged when her fever passed, from our room of tempered glass. And so home we went to 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 to mind this little one of ours. My mother knew as mothers do, when science failed to call on you. In my own head, the ticking clock chimed time to think outside the box. So early on an autumn dawn, we parked our car beside his lawn, and nor were we the first in line, such queues of people to the shrine, abide along on simple paths, on 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 hills outside and our flat. And once inside, the man himself picked Tessa up like fragile dove, examined her with care and thought both human traits that can't be born. And he firmly rubbed her on her side, saying sorry for her whimper cries. Hush there now a little. It's nearly over, almost done. Above your kidneys glands are blocked, they're moving now, I've them unlocked. So ease your crying and dry your tears, this must have been hell on your ears. The points that I've rubbed for you are directly connected to those organs that you need for hearing, and these stagnant nodes were interfering with your belly and with your gut. Those openings were tightly shut. So fear not granny, fear not dad, there have been dark days that you've had, but calm yourselves, that bridge is crossed. No need to feel that you are lost, and from tomorrow wait and see, she'll start eating heartily. So take that tube out of her nose and stick her back into her clothes and worry not, she'll be alright, sleep like a log for you tonight. And just like that, this quiet man, his massive, gnarled and healing hands, had brought the skeptic's heart to light, and I knew then, my man was right. That there's things in life we must accept to wander on this wondrous earth, that you will come and you will go, a speck amidst the cosmic flow. And technology has made us blind to the wonder of humankind. When heaven works through human hands, what knowledge fails to understand is that all the drops of wisdom gleaned are just drops of water in the stream that comes from a source that's higher up than we perceive in our minds through these optic cups. So accept this miracle, this gift, and welcome to the conscious shift. My child is cured, and not by those consultants in their fancy clothes, nor physicians' lettered names on plaques, nor scientists bent on proven facts. And a simple man with an open heart took my reality apart, proved seeking knowledge couldn't match, belief surpassed the surface scratched. My daughter's life I owe to him, whom I first called upon a whim.
The old turf fire, myself, with the back in the cradle, you can hear the granny say, I wished, go to sleep, Alana, till I wet your daddy's tail. Now, I have a little cottage, neat as it can be. You'll never see the likes of it this side of 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙. There's no piano in the corner, and no pictures on the wall, but I'm happy and contented in my little cottage hall. And the lady that I work for, she lives in a mansion.
Hello. I was asked to introduce, we're very fortunate to have Billy Nic Fhloinn speaking with us today. He's a man of many accolades. I was supposed to remember them, but there were many. He holds a PhD in Irish folklore and a BA in archaeology from UCD. He lectures in folklore and Irish studies, and has a research interest in calendar charts, ritual, and folk religion. He's also a celebrant for weddings and funerals. He is a musician, artist, author, and is the founder and creative director of the multidisciplinary project known as 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙. With no more ado, we're very glad to have him, Billy Nic Fhloinn.
Is je gaat er in mag was tacht man 𝕻𝖈𝖙 as thank you all very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to be to be with you here for this fantastic event. I was invited to come and speak, and I said yes before I knew what was involved, and I had a quick look at the programme, and I was even more enthusiastic about coming. So I'm very delighted to be here. 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖔𝖓. So I am going to talk about something that I spent 10 years of my life researching and studying, and that is the Feast of St. Martin in Ireland. It's a funny one here in Cork, especially. A lot of people have not heard of it, but it was once very, very widespread. So it's coming soon, the 11th of November, so we're not far away from 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of it, the blood and guts of it. Apologies to all vegetarians and vegans. This is what they did. So look, I'll tell you about it, and we're going to have some Q&A afterwards, I think, so I'd love to hear your responses when we get to it. So without further ado, I'm going to give you over to Mary Heafy, who I recorded. I met her on the side of the road in West Clare in 2005, and she very graciously agreed to be filmed. So I'll hand you over to her, and she can explain what is involved in St. Martin's Day.
On the eve of St. Martin, I do, yes. And it was a time where all the people would kill a goose or a turkey or chicken, whatever they would have, and spill the blood around and keep a little bit of the blood to keep away the sickness of that from the houses, which they thought was the custom at that time.
And you were saying that it could also help keep evil spirits away?
Well, yes, that's what they did it for, and to protect the animals and all that type of thing. And of course they would eat the fowl. They could cook the fowl the day after and eat it.
Right.
So it was a two-way thing.
And what was done with the blood, do you know?
The blood was sprinkled around the doors of the sheds and that, so that nothing would happen to their animals and their stock.
So she's pretty succinct about it, but she talks about how on St. Martin's Day, or the eve in particular of St. Martin's Day, people would kill animals and shed their blood. And it's a curious one, because when you look at St. Martin himself, who he was, he's a Christian saint. He was the son of a Roman soldier, and he was named after Mars, the god of war, but he became a Christian. And he is widely considered to be the patron saint of tavern keepers, horses, soldiers, animals, beggars, drunkards, which is very much not the case in Ireland, because we don't make wine. But the first of the wine is always ready on St. Martin's Day. So a lot of other countries held him in great esteem for the drinking of alcohol. Also saddlers, tailors, cloak makers, and cordwainers, which is an old-fashioned word for shoemakers. He died on the 8th of November, and he was buried on November 11th, and that is his feast day. And really, it is, I think, the coincidence of his death that has him connected to this time of year. I'll explain more about how and why this all came to be. But one of the most famous incidents of St. Martin revolves around the cloak of St. Martin. When he was a soldier, he was sitting on the back of a horse, and he met a beggar at the gates of 𝕻𝖈 who was naked and shivering, and he asked St. Martin, could he have his cloak? St. Martin took his cloak off and cut it in half with his sword, and he gave half the cloak to the beggar. And he had a vision that night when he saw Jesus wearing half the cloak, and he knew that it was time for him to become a Christian, so he joined the new religion. It's all very far removed from the killing of chickens, so how did we get there? Well, St. Martin, the cult, if you want to call it that, the following of St. Martin, the popularity of him in Ireland, was well known from a very early point. He was revered on the same level as St. Patrick, St. Bridget, and St. Clonakilty. So he's one of the very few non-native saints to be revered in the same breath as these others, so he was held in very high esteem. Part of that was, in his own lifetime, a biographer began to write his biography, and when he died, they published it, 𝕻𝖈𝖙, and it talks about this wonder-working saint who was banishing demons and making miracles left and right. There's one incident where he banishes a demon from a cow, but that's as close as we get to him being a patron saint of animals. So again, we're no closer to figuring out why we're killing animals and cutting off their heads on St. Martin's Day. We also see from a very early point, he was the first to be a bishop and an abbot. And in Ireland, in the medieval period, in monasticism, being a bishop and an abbot was something that went hand in hand. So he was the first to do this in Western Christendom. So he was kind of a poster boy for this model of Christianity that took hold in Ireland in the early medieval period. So much so that the Irish wanted to connect to him so much that they claimed, rather anachronistically, that he was the uncle of St. Patrick. But all the way through, what we're seeing here is a contrast between the folk concept of who St. Martin was, which we see in the folk traditions of the 19th, the 20th and 21st century, represented by the video there, and the ecclesiastical version of it. The ecclesiastical one, yes, he's a miracle worker, but he's quite a pious, quite a stern kind of character. And this is something to be found in the medieval period as well. Medieval St. Martin is quite a different figure to early Christian St. Martin. He died in his bed rather peacefully, but in Ireland, for some reason, in folk traditions, they say that he didn't die in his bed, that he was killed in a mill. And depending on where you see the legends, they say he was killed in County Mayo or County Clare or various different places. So the folk imagining of who he was versus the historical imagining is really quite different. But the folk image of St. Martin, where does it come from? It evolved through the medieval period, and we know that St. Martin's Day was once very, very popular throughout the medieval period. It persists to this day. His popularity persists still very much in the Balkans, where they still seem to be sacrificing animals down in that corner. But all the way through the medieval period and right across Europe, there was this very strong tradition of shedding blood. They would slaughter animals on his day. They would taste the new wine, which was ready at that time, and they would indulge in great feasts. There was great parades, fairs, festivals, all this kind of thing, and that's how he got the connection between drunkards. There are still some popular traditions to do with St. Martin, particularly parades with lanterns in Germany. I don't know if you've anybody from Germany or the German-speaking areas. You've probably done the lantern parade. Yeah. Rabimmel, Rabamel, Rabum, the song that they sing with their little. Yeah, I saw it there in the early 21st century. I was over there. But these are largely revival traditions, I think, of earlier medieval stuff. But what we can say with comfort, with safety and confidence, is that slaughter on St. Martin's Day and eating meat was once widespread right throughout Europe. In most places it's gone. I think in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal, they still roast a pig sometimes at fairs, and they eat it with roast chestnuts and new wine. We have some mention in the medieval period, and we will return to the medieval period towards the end when we're trying to make sense of all of this. But we have some mention of people slaughtering animals for St. Martin's Day. But the earliest context that we have for that happens in the Anglo-Norman context. So we really see the killing of animals on St. Martin's Day to be found amongst the English and the English-speaking peoples of Ireland from the 12th century onwards. Most records that we have to do with St. Martin, or at least most that I could find, come from the National Folklore Archive. I scoured the Folklore Archive, and I was very, very lucky that it was very comprehensively documented there. And I found 1,251 records. Some of them were negative records saying we have no memory of St. Martin in this place, but plenty of them had chapter and verse and exquisite detail about what people were doing. And Sean O'Sullivan, in his infinite wisdom, who worked for the Irish Folklore Commission, he saw that this was a kind of an interesting topic, kind of a juicy one. So he sent out questionnaires all over the country, and he asked people with this long list of questions, can you please send back your answers? What do you know about this custom? And he had a very comprehensive set of questions. So there's 10 full manuscript volumes just of Martinmas material. That's what we call it, like Christmas Martinmas. It's a good name. So Martinmas in Ireland. And this goes something towards explaining why the bloodshed at this time. It happens in November 11th, and November is an important time for agriculture. It is the time where the harvest is gathered. It is the time where, if you are keeping animals for the winter, the ones that you have sufficiently fattened with the excess from the harvest, and you don't want to keep them all winter, if you can't afford to keep a full byre of cattle or a certain amount of geese, now is the time to get rid of the ones that aren't going to make it through winter. So their animals are at their fattest, and it's time to kill them. And that idea of killing animals in November, this time of year, is probably, in terms of where we are in the world, is probably as old as agriculture. the end of the harvest is the time to slaughter the animals that aren't going to be kept over winter. So that's the first thing that we can sink our teeth into. We'll come back to it. But this is the time when everything is winding down, the threshing is finished. That explains a little bit about the mill legends, how he got killed in the mill. Winter ploughing has ceased. The cattle are brought to the infield for winter. Hiring fairs happened at this time and rents were paid. And very often the rent was paid by killing a pig and selling the meat. So again, it's all happening at this time. And the excess animals were slaughtered. Now, if all of this sounds familiar in terms of the end of harvest, traditionally in Ireland, Samhain was the time when all of this would have happened before the coming of the Anglo-Normans. So there is a connection between the two, and we'll come back to that as well. But I'll just talk about what people actually did, and then we'll explain maybe why. So the most common thing is the killing of animals. You had to shed blood for St. Martin's Day. Occasionally you get references to people who couldn't afford to shed the blood of an animal, so they would prick their finger and they would let blood fall. But the most important thing was that you shed blood in honour of the saint. And the most common way of doing that was by killing a cockerel. Or a goose, broadly speaking. So what did people do? This photograph was taken in Leitrim by Mary Kate McGlynn, no relation, in 1995, I think, or 96, by Joe McGowan. It's the only image that I know of in Irish tradition of this happening. She's standing outside her front door and the sun is setting. You can see the shadows are low. This is on the evening before St. Martin's Day, at sunset on the doorstep. And those are both very important things. So what was done? Animals were killed. Mostly people killed fowl because that's what they could afford. We have accounts, we have stories of people who had more money killing bigger animals. But a cockerel was the most common thing that was killed. Richer people sometimes killed pigs. And in legends of St. Martin's Day, we have talk of people killing cattle, which probably did happen in the high medieval period by those who could afford to kill cattle and divide up the meat and give it out to their neighbours, that kind of thing. Sheep and goats too, but they're rarer. So this is where I found the descriptions of St. Martin's Day. So you can see much of Ulster missing, and for some convoluted reason, County Cork is missing as well. If we have time, I'll get back to that. But my hypothesis is that it was well known in Ulster and Cork. But remind me if we do have time before the Q&A why I think it was not found in Ulster or Cork. It's mainly to do with the calendar and Protestants. So we'll get back to it maybe. So when I was trawling through the archives, you were saying, when did people kill for St. Martin? And most accounts don't really give a time, but those ones that do, they talk about a time that is in relation to a threshold or transition. And primarily they talk about sunset or nightfall, the turning point between the day and the night. They talk about the evening before the feast. And a bit like a lot of our customs and traditions, we all know that Christmas in Gaelic Ireland doesn't start in the morning of the 25th, it starts at nightfall on the night before. It's the same with 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙, of course. 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 is Halloween, it's the night before. That's the whole point, is that's Hallows Eve. And these are just some quotes that I picked at random from Tipperary. It is celebrated on the 11th of November, but birds are killed on the day before the feast. And from Galway, it says, generally a cock is chosen for the poultry yard by the woman of the house on the eve of the feast, the 10th of November, and killed by her outside the house. In Upper Church, it said, the woman of the house does the killing in the case of fowl, and the man in the case of animals. It is done at nightfall, so this is when day is turning into night. And we have nightfall there mentioned in Leitrim, and then the last one it says, with the dusk of the evening. So this consistent pattern, whenever they do talk about the time, it's always at these threshold times, these turning point times. And there's just a little map of the various different times, but they're all related thematically to this idea of the turning point from the day to night, and the turning point from the day before into St. Martin's Day. What was done with the blood? You would kill the animals, but unlike all other times of year, anytime you were killing at other times of year, the blood was kept. We know blood was kept for making black puddings, for example. But on St. Martin's Day, this was the only day that you didn't keep the blood for food. It was kept for other purposes. The blood was generally shed, and it was shed on the doorstep Again, the doorstep is a threshold place. It's the boundary between the safe inner house and outside, and all of the attendant dangers that could bring. They would daub the blood sometimes behind the door, or they would leave it fall on the doorstep. Also, there are accounts of the four corners of the house being marked out. And there's an idea, there's a theme running through this, that we are marking out our boundaries and we are marking our thresholds. And this is the theme that is consistent. So just a few more quotes here. 𝕻𝖗𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈 on the flagstone of the door, the bird is killed. The slaughtering is generally done on the threshold. And then we see the last one, the killing is done on the flagstone of the door or the threshold, and the blood is spilled on the flagstone. Here's a nice quote from 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙. Blood is spilled in honour of St. Martin. This is done in 2/3 of the houses here. Usually the cock's blood, but a goose will do the job. The woman of the house does the killing, but if she is dead or ill, the man of the house kills the bird. The killing is done on the threshold of the door, and it is killed at nightfall. And again, the picture of Mary Kate, thanks to Joe McCowan, we have her spreading the blood just outside her front door, and you'll notice the sun casting a long shadow because it's about to set. Here is that I did in County Clare, next to St. Martin's Well, in a place called Querrin. So I'll hand you over to John and Bridget.
The chickens were killed. I remember it even at home. They were killed on the open door of the house. It was on the step of the door, and that was the first one all the time was killed, and the last one then was killed in the stable, as Bridget already said. But the blood then would be poured onto a bit of cloth or a rag or whatever you like to call it, and that would be folded up and a string put around it. And I remember this in my time. And it would be put away in a safe place in the house for the 12 months until this thing happened again.
This is a variant that you get in County Clare, where instead of killing one, they kill two or sometimes three. One for the house to protect it, and one for the horse. Draft horses seem to have persisted in County Clare for a bit longer, and there's a very strong connection, right from medieval times, between St. Martin and horses. So you see in West Clare in particular, they kill one in the stable for the protection of the horse. And also in Clare, they very often kept the blood on a piece of cloth or on a piece of flax hull. After they had spun the flax, they would keep the hulls. But they used this blood then for curing. They would cure stitches or pain or disease or that kind of thing. So it's clear a pattern is building up that the blood was considered to be a sacred substance, and it had protective and magical properties. This next quote, it's very straightforward, but it paints a vivid picture. For me, the cock was killed on the threshold, the person doing it standing inside facing out. The killing took place at nightfall on the day before the feast. And that, to me, I think it encapsulates what's going on here, that people stood in the door looking out defiantly in the face of winter. I'll come back to that point. So some of them, the ones in Galway, for some reason Galway people liked to cut the head all the way off the chicken and throw it over the house, over the roof. I don't know. Practicing for hurling or something, I don't know. But this from Galway, it says the cock is supposed to be killed indoors, and when he is killed, the killer carries him around the corners of the house and across the hearthstone, letting the blood drip from him during that time. The head is cut off the cock and a cross is made on the inside of the back door, or the front one if there's no back one, with the door, with the blood of it. So again, marking the corners, marking the domestic space, and giving particular attention to the threshold, the point of ingress, the point where things from the dangerous outside can get into the safety of the inner space. And the hearth as well was marked. We know an open chimney is very vulnerable. There's all kinds of stories from other countries about chimneys needing protection. When my grandmother lived, the blood of St. Martin's roosters was spilled in the four corners of each room in the house. After her death, the kitchen was the only room thus protected. So here's just some more maps. The back door, the doorstep, the kitchen door are just the door, but you can see there's this preponderance to do with portals, thresholds. Why was it done? Lots of explanations given, but they're all related thematically. Protection, blessing, to ensure luck, to prevent evil, to prevent death, to keep out evil spirits, and sometimes the fairies specifically are mentioned as being a manifestation of the kind of thing people wanted to keep away. Sligo, it says, the sprinkling of the blood is supposed to keep illness away from the animals on the farm. And in Leitrim, the reason for doing it, that they will have good luck and all the property and crops and cattle will be under the protection of St. Martin, and that they will be successful and prosperous for the coming 12 months. In Kildare, the accounts I found from Kildare, there was a small few, and they were quite vivid and quite unusual, so I don't really know what to make of them, but here they are anyway. The object or motive was to invoke the aid of the Trinity and St. Martin to banish all evil spirits from the house and from each room of the house. It was also done to prevent all evil spirits from entering the house, the rooms, and the out offices. It was also to prevent sickness or plague from entering the house, thus safeguarding the inhabitants and the animals from sickness. And in Leitrim it says it was believed that any house in which this sprinkling of blood was done, that it was impossible for any evil spirit to pass the threshold. So they're pretty consistent about how they conceived of what this was doing, and it was protecting people inside. Here again, this is Talty, who I had the good fortune to interview in Clare as well. But you've heard of bleeding for St. Martin, killing a cock?
Oh yes, on the feast day. Yes, and you're talking about that. 𝕻𝖗𝖈𝖊 and to spread the blood in the doors of the house and the cabins, co-cabins, and the houses, shades of red, and around the yards. They sing the pass around the farmhouse.
And
they believed, you see, that by doing this, all anything bad would be kept away, like sickness from the cattle and all that. That nothing bad would happen.
And there was some mention of the fairies, was there? That some people might have thought.
Yeah, anything like that. I don't know whether the fairies are bad or good, but they haven't so much come around anyway.
And do you know? And Frank O'D, who I met again on the side of the road near County Clare on a dark November evening. I wish the camera was better because he was wearing a very nifty boy's own hat.
The blood would be sprinkled around either the four corners of the house or else the four corners of the farm, walk around the land. That was supposed to ward off diseases from stock and things by going around the land. So that was an old custom.
And was St. Martin thought of as protecting the stock?
I'd say so, yeah.
So he expands the zone of protection out the farm, which is something that we see in other times, 𝕵𝖆𝖈 as well, the fact that one would protect by defining the boundary, by walking it, by using sacred substances like holy water, or in this case blood, you protect the entire area. So protection is this overwhelming theme to do with it. We'll skip through some of these. Who did the killing? There's a strong correlation between the animal killed and the person who did the killing. In most instances, 1,235 accounts, fowl were offered, and it was mainly women who killed the fowl. Persons of means who offered pigs, sheep and cattle in 239 accounts, and in these cases it was mainly men who did the killing. There's a very straightforward explanation for this really, is that the remit, very often in terms of the division of labour, the remit of the man was to look after the fields and look after the bigger animals, and then traditionally it was usually the remit of the woman of the house to look after the household itself and the domestic fowl who stayed close. So it was whoever kept the animals killed the animals, which seems kind of fair. So the woman of the house kills a bird and the man kills any other animal. That's pretty consistent all the way through. So what was killed? 43% of all creatures killed were cockerels. Sometimes cocks were killed, particularly for horses, like I said, in County Clare. So that's something that was found. This is a distribution map where you find accounts talking about this cockerels being killed for horses. It stands to reason because St. Martin in all the medieval depictions is seen as a saint mounted on horseback. The earliest depictions of him, he's not on horseback, but once the idea of crusading knights and saints to protect crusading knights became a big thing in the medieval period, we start to see military saints like St. Martin, like St. George, appearing on horseback. So when soldiers got up on horses, so did military saints. So that's it. The next most common, and this is much common in Europe, is to kill a goose. In Ireland it was a cockerel, but most places in Europe people killed geese. 267 accounts of that. And in Ireland it was very often seen as more prestigious than a cockerel was to be able to kill and eat a goose on St. Martin's Day. So there's an account there. Fine fat goose is preferred by people to have killed in his honour. It is thought to be the best and most esteemed bird to kill for the feast. Rich and poor are the same in this instance. They all think a goose is the right bird to kill, and the poorest person would seek to get one to have, and the richest person is happy with it. If there's a poor woman who does not have her own goose, she saves the price and she buys one and takes it home, maybe 3 weeks before the feast, and it is fattened and fed at home. If there are not geese available to buy in the home area, she would go to any length to get one. So other instances then which are less frequent: sheep and lambs, pigs, and again pigs are more common historically in continental Europe. Goats. Only 2% of accounts talk about bovines, cattle being killed specifically for St. Martin, but cost is most likely the factor. Who are we getting our sources from? Who are the folklore archives collecting from in the 1930s? And they're not the great and the good, really. That's not where they focused. They focused on what they considered to be the ordinary people of the countryside who could afford geese or cockerels. So that's probably the preponderance of why it's coming forward in these numbers. But cattle are the ones mentioned in legends. Legends, and we won't get too much into the legends because it's a whole other thing of itself, but the legends were used as exemplars. Good behaviour, how you teach good behaviour, and how bad behaviour is punished in legend as well. So if you're using exemplars, what's the best thing to kill? What's the rightest thing to kill? It's a cow because it's the most valuable thing that somebody had to offer. So the legends are the hypothetical best case scenario. And in that case, you give all you have, which is a cow. Fortunately, in those people who offered their last cow to St. Martin very often found it reassembled and back to life the next day. So he was generous in that sense. The flesh, in most instances, the flesh was eaten, but the blood was not. Sorry. So, there's a common legend about St. Martin which talks about how he sorry, just give me a second. Test. 1, 2. The hardware is failing here. The software is going great. There's a common legend which talks about when the blood was kept and it was placed on a piece of flax. No, I'm grand. I've had a cough for about 5 weeks, so I'm coming out the side of it now. I thought I was escaping it, but maybe I need some St. Martin's blood. That would help. There's a common legend which talks about St. Martin's blood, which is put on a piece of flax tab, and it was kept back and placed on your side if you had a stitch or a bad appendix or anything like that. And there's a migratory legend which talks about Mary and Jesus going around to various different places. It was very common amongst the travelling community because they saw themselves in Mary and Jesus going from place to place. And it talks about how a stern woman and a kind man, or sometimes the sexes are reversed, how the man refuses to let them stay in the house, so they have to stay out in the shed, and in the middle of the night he is seized with a pain in his side, and Mary and Jesus come in and they take some of this flax and they place it on his side and they say a prayer and he is healed. But it's a fascinating history to that legend. It's told in Ireland in connection with St. Martin's Day, but it actually goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. I don't know how to pronounce his name, 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖊𝖈, I think he was a Hungarian folklorist. He traced this story back to Isis and Osiris all the way back in ancient Egypt. It became Christianized at some point and it made it all its way up through Europe. And in Ireland, we find it in context of healing in St. Martin's Day. So some of the narratives are quite old, they have a long pedigree in the past, but in most instances it's pretty straightforward that the flesh is eaten for dinner. A good meal is made of the fowl, all of that kind of stuff, and you can see where people are eating on St. Martin's Day. The flesh is considered food. Occasionally it is seen as promoting health, so if you eat the fowl on St. Martin's Day, it would give you health and that kind of thing. But in some instances, the flesh is eaten by the people of the house. It's a cure for diseases in cattle. If you leave some of the bones or the flesh by a byre, it will keep away disease. But for the most part, the bird itself was not the main event. It was the bird's blood. There's nothing really interesting that I could find in terms of how it was eaten. They just thought that it was roasted, sometimes on Sunday, that kind of thing. One thing that they did was St. Martin's charity. And this is probably an echo of the idea of him cutting his cloak in half and giving it to a beggar, that that people felt a pressure to share the food, the largesse, that it was incumbent upon them, especially if you had excess fowl, to give one to a poor neighbour, and that they could kill it themselves, or on St. Martin's Day, if you had excess meat, that it was divided out amongst people. And this, again, it goes back to the medieval period and that kind of thing, but it's hugely emphasised, I think, in Ireland in a post-famine context, where charity with food. There's a whole host of legends to do with people giving away the last of their food, and they are hugely popular after the famine, and it is because for so many people that was the only thing that kept others alive, was giving away. And in some instances it's giving away of your last cow or your last animal, or the giving away of the seed corn is another thing. And then, you know, once you give away the seed corn, that's you done for. You can't plant your crops next year. So they do this, they give it away even though they know it'll bring doom to them, and then they go back in the next day and they open the stores and they're overflowing with food. So there's this theme in post-famine Ireland: be generous, help each other out. You can understand why. And it's very much tied into St. Martin's Day as well. That's what we find. But the atmosphere of St. Martin's Day, if you want to call it that, the vibe of it sometimes was quite unusual. It is a night of fear rather than rejoicing. And it says, good luck is supposed to follow the observance of the time-honoured ceremony, and evil is the punishment which is visited on those who neglect it. St. Martin will take something unless blood is spilled for him. It is very bad to neglect it, even today. And in these instances, St. Martin not only becomes the protector, he is viewed as the protector of animals, but he also becomes the agent of retribution for those who fail to provide to him. So not only is it good to give to him, but it's bad if you don't. Good luck is supposed to follow the observance of the time-honoured ceremony, and evil is the punishment which is visited on those who neglect it. St. Martin will take something. It is said that if a person neglects to shed blood in honour of the saint himself will do the killing. Many of his flock will die during the year. And it's said in olden times, if you did not draw blood for St. Martin, he would draw blood from you. And there's lots of legends to do with this. St. Martin coming and being vengeful against those who would neglect him. This is common in folklore traditions. I know, again, in German-speaking area, we have Frau Perchta, I think she's called. Perchta, the belly slitter. And if you didn't feast and eat lots of food over Christmas, she would come and open your belly at night and stuff it full of rubbish and sew you back up. So, the legends, I'll touch on the legends and then I will talk a bit more about some of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. But loads of examples of the cloak legend, no surprise. These are just folk versions of the ecclesiastical story, which would have been read from pulpits and all of that kind of thing. It's a very, very common story. 30 examples that I found of stories where people would offer animals to St. Martin, and they would wake up in the morning and the last animal that they gave was revived. So I won't go through all of this, but I'll just go to the end. He threw the skin and horns down to the bottom of the house in the place where the cow was tied into and went to sleep. He was happy, even though the cow was dead, and even though he wouldn't have milk anymore, he was happy after that, and he was able to spill blood for St. Martin. When he got up the next morning, the cow was standing at the bottom of the house, and the halter on her was as good as she had ever been, which is good news. An international folktale, which is very common all the way through Europe, talks about this. Hospitality rewarded, and it's found all over Europe. There's a motif there that you can see, resuscitated eaten animal. So saints or other religious figures, perhaps deities in some instances, come to the house and people give them offerings and the animal is magically brought back to life. In one very strange legend that I came across, I'll just read it out because it's a good one. St. Martin, having given away all his goods to the poor, was often in want of food, and one day he entered a widow's house and he begged for something to eat. The widow was poor, and having no food in the house, she sacrificed her young child, boiled it, and set it before the saint for supper. Having eaten and taken his departure, the woman went over to the cradle to weep for her lost child, don't worry, when, lo, there he was, lying whole and well, in a beautiful sleep, as if no evil had ever happened to him. And to commemorate the miracle, and from gratitude to the saint, a sacrifice of something is made yearly in his honour. 20 versions of this from Ireland. It's kind of bonkers. But I think it might have its origins in a funny story where a saint comes and she wants to make a gift and he says, "What is dearest to you?" And she kind of misunderstands the object of the exercise and kills her child. So the saint has to bring the child back to life. But strangely enough, it's not found anywhere in Western Europe. The closest example I could find of it was in Lithuania. So how it got to Ireland and connected to St. Martin, I don't know, but it did, and that's where we find it, here and there around the place. 36 examples of miraculous rewards where people kill animals, or maybe one or two animals, and then they wake up in the morning and they have 5 times or 10 times as many as they had offered. And again, this is related to post-famine Ireland, the idea charity and generosity being a very, very important part of the culture, and it's promoted even when it happened at great personal cost. It's promoted as being the right thing to do. The flip side then is if you are mean, St. Martin will punish. And again, talks about people who are ungenerous getting punished miraculously. The woman told her she would not kill a goose or a bird because she didn't believe in that kind of thing at all, and so it was. The next day she went out to feed the hens, and everyone was stretched out dead in front of her. She went back and told the sad story to Eileen, who was the servant girl. She started laughing at her and said, "Now, do you believe that there's such a thing as the saint now?" From then on, she killed the best bird she had. So, lots of variants of that story as well. But the legends are clear. Do it. It's the right thing to do, and if you don't, bad things will happen. Just a little bit about patronage of St. Martin. It seems in the medieval period, at least, St. Martin was a much more popular saint than he was in the 20th century when most of the material was collected here. When you look at wells and churches dedicated to St. Martin, you see that there's a fairly even distribution around the country. There is a connection often, or sometimes in these instances, between the aristocracy, rich people patronising churches and wells, and these are some church sites. Again, one in Cork, one in Ulster as well. So my contention is that St. Martin's Day was celebrated all over the country. It's just convoluted reasons why it wasn't in the 20th century. So, what's going on here? What's all this about, really? So there's a definite sense of unease associated with the Feast of St. Martin, and legends and beliefs concerning the supernatural repercussions that one could face are manifold. The threat of death, loss, and disease are amply demonstrated in legend and belief statements, where people are just saying things about what they believe. And they testify to the anxieties experienced by an agricultural people facing into a period of greater uncertainty. St. Martin's Day is poised on the threshold of winter, and winter brings storms, it brings colds and flus, it brings disease, it brings dirt and muck and mire, and it brings lots of negative things along with that. There is a connection between St. Martin's Day and boundaries. Liminal spaces, these are spaces on the threshold between inside and outside, between day and night, between the safe, domestic, and the wild outdoors. This is where the action took place. People marked the boundaries of the house, the four corners of the house. They were concerned with agricultural production. And they did it at a liminal time. So it's a liminal space on the doorstep. They did it at a liminal time, at sunset. And in terms of the cycle of the year, this is the turning point from summer to winter. So to tie it in with the theme, my contention is that it inherited these themes from the traditional observance of Samhain, such as we can tell what that was. There is a connection between the two in the folk mind. Samhain was the predecessor of modern All Hallows Eve, and in many respects, a lot of the importance that we see to do with Samhain comes from its agricultural significance. It was an important part of the ritual year and the agricultural year. And St. Martin's Day, I think, inherited some of this importance. Not all of it, because lots of the supernatural remained associated with Samhain, but there's reasons why it moved. So, if we look at Irish tradition to do with Samhain, we see that in the Indo-European reckoning of time, there were originally two major seasons, summer and winter, the dark half and the light half. And we see echoes of this twofold division going into the medieval period. It's an ancient system of reckoning time, and it survived into the historical period down through a number of Western European countries. In Old Irish literature, we have a story from the Ulster cycle, the wooing of 𝕻𝖈. And it said, Ben Suan, son of 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙, this is translated from Old Irish, or Middle Irish, I think, which he said, this is the same thing, I shall fight without harm to myself from Samhain, which is the end of summer. For two divisions were formerly in the year, that is, summer from 𝕆𝖆𝖈𝖙, the 1st of May, and winter from Samhain to 𝕆𝖆𝖈𝖙. If we reverse the clock back earlier than the medieval period, there's 6 months, there's exactly 6 months, so 1st of May, 1st of November, half the division of the year. So Samhain, if we go back to what we think it might have been, agriculturally and perhaps ritually, it's the point in the calendar where the grazing term ends. The grass stops growing. Cattle were brought from the outfields to the infields close to the home for winter, and some of these animals were selected for slaughter. If we look at mythological texts and stories from the epic literature of the Old and Middle Irish period, we see a connection between the feasting of meat and the celebration of Samhain. For example, in the 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖔𝖓, the destruction of 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙, the characters feast at Samhain on a living pig. There I beheld at the fire in front of me a man with black cropped hair, having only one eye and one foot and one hand, which is the quintessential otherworld figure. Having on the fire a pig, bald, black, singed, squealing continually, and in the company of the great-mouthed woman. Liken that now, O 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙, as in, what's this? Easily done. That's 𝕻𝖊𝖈𝖙 with his pig and his wife, 𝕻𝖗𝖔𝖊𝖈. They, the wife and the pig, are the proper instruments on the night that ye destroy Conor, king of Éirinn. Alas for the guests who will run between them, 𝕻𝖊𝖈𝖙 with his pig is one of Conor's taboos. So it's a deeply supernatural tale where the disruption of the natural order is happening, and it happens at Samhain. There's other stories to do with the feasting of pigs at Samhain. One of the stories from Tipperary talks, it's the alternate version of how Finn McCool got his wisdom I'll summarise very, very quickly. But the Fianna are roasting a pig on the banks of the shore, and a supernatural being comes out, down, snatches the pig away. So they go again, second night, comes down, snatches the pig away. So 𝕻𝖈𝖗𝖎𝖈 himself said he's going to guard the pig for the third night. So the supernatural being comes out, he grabs the pig, and 𝕻𝖈𝖗𝖈 follows him, and he runs all the way to the top of 𝕸𝖆𝖌𝖎𝖈𝖊, and he's about to go back into the other world with the pig, and 𝕻𝖈𝖗𝖈 casts a spear through him and wounds him mortally, and he makes his way into the other world. 𝕻𝖈𝖗𝖈 stretches out his hand in order to grab the pig, or to grab him, and a woman from the fairy from the other world, she slams the door shut, and the only part of his body that goes into the other world is his thumb. She's holding a cup which has supernatural liquor in it, and it spills on his thumb, and he pulls his thumb out and he sticks it in his mouth, and suddenly he has 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈 illumination. Whatever about the ins and outs of the story, we know that the roasting of pigs at Samhain was something that seems to predate the coming of the Anglo-Normans. So Samhain came up against Christianity, and it gradually evolved and changed into All Hallows Eve. The celebration of All Saints' Day, November 1st, and All Souls, November 2nd, can clearly be seen as Christian festivals that eclipsed and replaced Samhain. But like many feast days in the Christian tradition, meat was forbidden from being consumed on All Saints' Day, which might go towards explaining why the consumption of pork was displaced from Samhain. Think about traditional Samhain food. There's no meat anywhere. It's called cannon, it's pandy, cham, it's nuts, apples, fruit. There's no meat. But there was, if you go back far enough. So where did all the meat eating on Samhain go? Well, as I said, because it was a agricultural feast, this was at the time of year when you would slaughter pigs, when you would slaughter the animals that wouldn't make it through winter. And we can see a very definite shift happening. Rent and tribute in the early medieval period that was paid at Samhain under the Gaelic system is now paid to the Anglo-Norman lords on St. Martin's Day. St. Martin was a patron of the Anglo-Normans. He set up his whole thing in France, of course, and the English held him in great esteem as well. So this is a Christian feast day in which the slaughtering of meat would take place. And the only reason I think why St. Martin even became associated with slaughtering was that he happened to die in November, and November's the time you kill. So that's it. It's pretty straightforward. But the earliest examples of Martinmas slaughter in Ireland all come from an Anglo-Norman context. And in example, in Limerick City, they instituted a fair on St. Martin's Day. So if we look at the themes, and I should say I found over 60 examples of saying 𝕻𝖑𝖈𝖙𝖈𝖊, which means 9 nights and a night without counting, so 10 nights. From November night to St. Martin's night, and that's what you get from the 31st to the 10th, or the 1st to the 11th. So there's a very strong sense in the folk tradition that St. Martin's Day and Samhain are thematically connected. So November 11th, like Samhain, is an important agricultural point. Threshing and winter ploughing ceased and all of that, and the excess animals were slaughtered. There is this 10-day or 11-day discrepancy from St. Martin's Day to Halloween, and these are 64 examples that I found of this saying. So if we come back to the idea of liminality, of boundaries, of thresholds, we see them both present in Samhain. Samhain is the quintessential threshold time. The other world and the natural world are imminent at this time. And early Irish literature and folk traditions from the 20th century all the way up to the 20th and 21st century are very, very clear in the idea that the supernatural and the natural are very, very close at this time, and you can move from one realm into the other. All kinds of stories of people from there coming here, people, supernatural beings coming from there to here, and people coming from here to the other world. That was what Samhain was, and those themes carry over into St. Martin's Day to an extent. So, if thresholds are the most important, the most usual place where the act of killing was undertaken, the blood was shed on the doorstep. It banished bad luck, it banished supernatural forces and disease from the coming years. The four corners of the house were marked with the blood, ritually reaffirming the boundaries of the home and demarcating it with a protective substance. So, to just roll into the twofold year just for a minute, we have Samhain at one end, and then 𝕵𝖆𝖈 at the other. Or, as time went on, the ritual importance of Samhain was divided between St. Martin's Day and Samhain itself. But this 2 waypoints in the year, particularly the pastoral year, the agricultural people, we see a similar dichotomy in Europe, where Martinmas and St. George's Day at the end of April, these are the two poles by which the ritual year, the agricultural pastoral year, turned in many places in Europe. So, if Martinmas is connected to Samhain and Samhain is connected to 𝕵𝖆𝖈, can we see a connection between Martinmas and 𝕵𝖆𝖈? That would really hammer it home. That would really, make me think I'm on the right track. So, if we look at 𝕵𝖆𝖈 quickly, I won't overdo it. 𝕵𝖆𝖈 had a lot of the same concerns that Samhain and St. Martin's Day both have. They were concerned with protection and with keeping the luck of the farm intact. People were worried about evil magic and anxiety. And dairy products in particular, this was the start of the period when dairy products the grass was starting to grow, the animals were driven to the uplands, to the boulis for the summer, and this was the time that you needed to protect the dairy. So 𝕵𝖆𝖈 in lots of ways is temporally liminal. It's on the turning point, not from summer to winter, but winter to summer. And lots of rituals of protection and reaffirmation going on at this time. So the parallels are pretty overwhelming when we hold them side by side. In some places, a family member, often a woman, would walk right around the boundary of the farm carrying the first water from the well. So just like what Frank O'D said, you walk the boundaries of the farm in order to protect it. In some places, on a May morning, the woman bringing the water, though she went for it on the usual path, would bring it home by a different route, travelling if possible on the backs of the boundary ditch for part of the way, even though it meant doubling the journey. The idea being that walking along the water on the boundaries, no neighbour could work any 𝕵𝖆𝖈 or loss to her cattle or means for the year. So you protect the farm, you protect the cattle, you reaffirm your boundaries. Another way you do that is on May Eve, in many districts, the father of the house lights a candle and blesses the threshold, the hearth, and the four corners of the house with Easter water. Not blood, but a sacred protective substance, doing the exact same thing. Another custom, which was scrupulously observed after sunset on the eve of 𝕵𝖆𝖈, farmers would walk with their servants and domestics, would walk around the boundaries of the farm in a procession, carrying the implements of husbandry, seeds of corn, the 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖊, so water from the well, and other requisites, especially the sacred 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖊, if any was fortunate enough to possess it. Procession always halted at the most convenient stations facing the four cardinal points, beginning in the east, and went through several ceremonies, digging a sod, breaking it fine, and sowing seed, after which they sprinkled the glebe with the 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖊. They protected the threshold of the house as well, not with blood, but with a May bush. This was to keep out evil spirits, a brightly decorated bush with eggshells and paper and things like that. And the idea was to protect the house, to protect the farm, and it was done at the doorstep. There's all these stories of milk stealing rituals which happen at this time. Butter stealing witches, which were a big concern for people, who would intrude upon your farm. And the way they would operate, they would cross over the boundary into your farm and they would scoop up the dew from your grass. And in the same way, they would skim the dew from the grass, symbolically skimming the cream off your milk. And then your cows, no matter how hard you churn the milk, wouldn't produce butter. But your neighbour who did this would produce twice as much butter. So it's concern with magical ingress and protecting the boundaries. Different places, the point where three streams meet, you could work this magic. You would say the words, all for myself and nothing for the rest of them. Lots of legends, particularly amongst Protestants. In fact, there's a complex reason for that. It's mainly to do with the fear of witches and the devil. But women were considered to be particularly good at affecting butter stealing. And farmers would see a hare suckling one of their cows. They'd take out a gun and they would shoot the hare. And the hare would leave a trail of blood, and the farmer would follow the trail of blood to a locked door. And then he'd look in the window, and there's an old woman sitting in the chair with a bullet wound. So she was turning herself into a hare to steal the butter. But again, the concerns in many ways are the same. The greatest time of risk was between sunset on May Eve and sunrise on May Day. And Patricia Lycett, who I had the great fortune to study under in the National Folklore Archives and the 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈 Centre for Irish Folklore, she summarises traditions to do with 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙 thusly. Verdure customs, the idea of putting green plants at the doorstep in order to protect the house. Protected the household look and prosperity. And of course, the greenery symbolised the vitality and fertility of the summer season. The May bough, this idea of putting boughs of greenery or new flowers at the doorstep. Flowers and the bush were always strategically placed at the main exit and entry points in the house. And they served to reinforce boundaries against the neighbours who might approach or enter the house with evil intent. So, if the complex of beliefs and activities surrounding 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙 can be seen as originating in the human desire for ritual protection against potentially harmful supernatural agencies at the beginning of the grazing period, then the rituals of St. Martin's Day can be seen as an expression of similar desires at the end of the same period. These are bookends. So Samhain surely occupied this position in the pre-Christian and early medieval period, but its economic and agricultural significance became transferred to St. Martin's Day in the Middle Ages. And again, just to tie it up, there are customs and there are traditions and accounts of people ritually shedding blood at 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙. Not killing the animals, but they were drawing blood on 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙. So the balance of evidence suggests that 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙 and St. Martin's Day were ritually connected. They acted as bookends to the cattle grazing season and therefore were important in terms of rights of protection and health for the animals as well as humans. So there are blood rights for the benefit of animals which happen on 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙. So I think that it shows pretty well that the two are thematically connected. So blood was drawn on May 1st or close to it in order to provide health for the cattle in the coming season. I'll give you one good account from 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 father in his book Popular Irish Superstitions in 1853. He talks about, he uses the royal we, which is on brand, I think. We have known each head of cattle to be slightly singed with lighted straw upon May Eve, or have a lighted coal passed around their bodies as is customary after calving. And it was not unusual some 15 or 20 years ago to bleed a whole herd of cattle upon a May morning and to dry and burn the blood. So they're drawing the blood and they're not using it as food in this instance. It was something that they did during the summer when the cattle were very healthy and eating loads of grass. They could draw some blood and make black pudding kind of things essentially out of it. It was a way of having meat type products without killing the animal. But on 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙 they didn't eat it. He said, we have more than once when a boy seen the entire of the great fort of 𝕲𝖊𝖈𝖙, then the centre of the most extensive and fertile grazing districts of Connacht, literally reddened with the blood thus drawn on a May morning. Bleeding the cattle at this time of year was evidently done with a sanitary intention, as some of the older medical works recommended in the human subject. So bloodletting, essentially. But choosing that particular day, and subsequently the burning of the blood, was evidently vested of some heathen rite, which is again very on brand for these characters. But there is an echo of older customs there, I think. And the fact that they did it at 𝕲𝖊𝖈𝖙, which has all kinds of historical and even mythological significance, is probably not a coincidence. So different examples of it. Here's one from Ross in County Galway, talking about, and I found them all over the country, quick brief accounts of people letting blood from cattle on 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙. So St. Martin's Day, poised on the threshold of winter, is the perfect analogue to 𝕸𝖆𝖈𝖙, and I think it inherited its role from Samhain in this regard. The rituals of shedding blood for the saint were performed at temporally liminal times, most often at sunset, on the eve of the saint's feast. So the common themes between them all are liminality, physical at the doorstep, the four corners, and temporal at sunset, at the turning point of summer to winter, or winter to summer. Liminal time and space are encountered in the same way. Magical, powerful, and potentially dangerous. We find the danger in the in-between. And malign magic, dangerous magic, butter-stealing magic, evil spirits are most powerful at these in-between times. But conversely, prophylactic magic, preventative magic, protective magic was equally powerful. And people asserted control in the in-between through ritual, through prayer, and through folk magic. And again, if we return to the householder standing defiantly in the doorstep, physically, temporally, spiritually, if you want, in the threshold of what was coming, the season that was coming, and they stare down the danger and they make an offering and they assert control over the situation. It has a power to it, I think. So thresholds being the most important place in which the act of killing was undertaken, the blood was shed on the doorstep to banish bad luck, supernatural forces and disease from the household for the coming year. The four corners were marked with the blood, ritually reaffirming the boundaries of the home and demarcating it with a sacred substance. How old is this custom? We don't know. 12th century maybe. But I think the idea of this is much, much older. And I think ritual animal sacrifice is very commonly found throughout the world in a lot of different cultures, and very often it has similar kinds of themes. Not always, but it has similar kinds of themes. And therefore, the numinous nature of the threshold as a terminus between the domestic and the wild is a collective concept in folk customs. And thus, to find sacrificial rites at this location, it further emphasizes their universality. The rite itself, as well as the context in which it's found, can be seen to transcend particular religious notions. And it expresses psychological concepts that have their ultimate origins in the commonality of the human experience. 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈. So I'd be happy to take questions. I don't know how long we have, but I'll take questions until they pull a big crook and pull me off the stage, or until you stop asking them, which means you're fully educated and have nothing left to teach you. But does anyone want to ask something?
Yeah, in some stone circles, like for example, 𝕻𝖗𝖏𝖏 there in North West Cork, it's aligned with the sunset for Samhain, where you go through you looked at through the portal stone, through the central burial stone, and then over the axial stone, and you get to see the sunset particularly at Samhain. Now, that marker it doesn't work with the calendar year. How are they putting it as the 11th? Because when did the...
I don't understand what you mean, it doesn't work with the calendar year.
Well, no, like, you know, the way we have our is it the Julian calendar we use?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, for example, it shifts. Like, for example, it could be the 7th on November, like this year.
Yeah.
And then another could be the 6th or the 5th, or it could be the 8th.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the precise date of when Samhain was celebrated before the medieval period. Was it always the 1st of November? I mean, it's there or thereabouts, I think. I really don't know enough about alignments. Frank Prendergast is the man to ask about that. He's done a lot of work on archaeoastronomy and alignments and the significance or not of various different alignments. I know there's the sunset at Samhain, it shines into the Mound of the Hostages at Tara.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about it to say one way or the other, but I do think that the 11th of November was purely because that was the day the Christian saint was buried. Yeah. But there was a sort of a motif attraction or a migration of importance when the Anglo-Normans came in. The Anglo-Normans didn't know or care what Samhain was. It wasn't their feast day. November 11th was, because that was a convenient saint's day which fell around the time, in and around the time when the harvest was over, the milling is finished, the animals are being slaughtered. So that's really why they're all clustering around that date. So in terms of alignments, I don't know enough. Frank Prendergast is your man there.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So, is it similar then to your companions here, Bridget and Lou, that the way that they were, these characters were taken over by the Christian, they sort of put a Christian cloak on them. Is Martin then the host sort of Samhain celebrations then in some ways?
I think that the Martinian lore is very self-contained and very well developed in and of itself. You know, with Lou certainly, and arguably with Bridget, you have pre-existing characters who, I don't know how much we can tell about what they were before the coming of Christianity, but Martin, St. Martin, is a fully realized Christian character. He's a Christian figure based on a real life human being that existed. So I don't know if he is occupying the particular role of any individual deity or spirit or character or anything like that. There's no single figure associated with Samhain as far as I know. Mungand, arguably. But he is a fully formed Christian figure in and of himself. You know, the importance of his day inherited a certain amount of cachet, a certain amount of ritual significance. And I think it can tell us a bit about what Samhain might have looked like or what might have happened at Samhain. But really, the medieval and the folk creation and depiction of who St. Martin was, it was a work in progress as well. You know, the folk version of St. Martin was always flexing and changing and adapting to what people wanted and what they wanted to say. How does he become a patron of animals? How does he become a patron of millers, of retribution? There's no connection with him and alcohol in Ireland because we don't make wine. So once the context is gone, he's gone. And like a very good example of the adaptability and changeability of these things, or in some cases the precariousness of it. I spoke to a woman who had done this killing in 2003. She told me she had done it the year before in 2002. And that was the last living example that I could find of somebody doing it. And I asked her why she stopped. And she said a fox got in and killed her fowl. She said, I'm old, I don't really want to be getting new ones. And within that one instance, and she also said, it's easier to buy a chicken in the shop. And she's right. If you've tried to raise your own fowl for the table, it's a long, convoluted process when you can buy chickens, ethically or not, for very cheap in a supermarket. So a lot of my field work, I spoke to the older generation who had done it, I spoke to the middle generation who had seen it, and then I spoke to the younger generation and they'd never heard of it. So you have this thing which is 800 years old, arguably 15 or 1800 years old, or who knows how old it goes, gone in the space of one generation because the context is gone. Supermarkets finished off the cult of St. Martin in Ireland, and that's the long and short of it. But all the way through the development of this character, he's changing, he's becoming different things according to what local needs are. So he's a mutable and adaptable figure, like a lot of folklore figures are. Whether he has any predecessor that he's filling the shoes of in particular, I don't know. I found no evidence for that. But he's a very vivid and fully realised character in and of himself. So, there you go. Yeah.
Is there any record of horses being sacrificed?
Possibly, but not in a Martinmas context that I could see. The sacrifice of horses does seem to be more connected to kingship rituals. I mean, you can get into the nuts and bolts of that, but the aversion to horse flesh that you find in the medieval period, and the reason why we don't really eat horse meat was because in the medieval period it was associated with heathen rites, and particularly heathen rites to do with kingship rituals. You get that, arguably, in the Celtic-speaking areas. You definitely get it in the Anglo-Saxon areas and the Germanic-speaking areas. So it was not the ordinary people who were doing it. There are horse bones found at Tara, for example, which could be seen as to do with kingship rituals. There's the accounts of 𝕵𝑆 Comprensis, come from the 12th century, but they maybe contain echoes of horse sacrifice. Stories with St. Olin, who also talk about horse sacrifice. So the archaeological record does suggest that it did happen. It does suggest that it happened in Ireland. There are hints in medieval period that might be echoes of older things. Maybe that, you know, depends on who you listen to. but it's nearly always found in a royal context. And therefore, the kind of sources I'm looking at, which are medieval and modern sources, have nothing to say on the sacrifice of horses. Did horses get sacrificed at Samhain? Maybe, but we don't know. Yep.
It's really tragic just how quickly so many traditions are dying in this country, and just in, as you said, a single generation. Would you be interested in seeing a revival of any sort of these traditions? And if you are, like, how do you think they could be done? Because, I mean, probably Peter would be onto us, like, did some of this, you know?
Yeah. I kind of, because when I was going through all of this and thinking about it, I came up with a strategy for observing it, which Bo Almqvist, who is an emeritus professor of folklore in UCD, he called it neo-Martinism, where you donate blood. You go to the Red Cross and you donate blood. Now, unfortunately, I once got a transfusion, which means you can't donate blood ever again, which doesn't give you great confidence in the product. But if you wish to revive it in a way that makes sense, then maybe donating blood, it's pretty straightforward. Peter won't have a problem with it. Everybody will be happy, and you get a cup of tea and a biscuit at the end. I think, you know, if people are eating meat, I'm pontificating now because I have a little pulpit in front of me, but I think if you're eating meat, it is useful at some point to kill an animal, to see what it's like. Because if you're doing this thing every day, we have industrialized it to the point where we no longer see what it's like. And in the past, if you wanted to eat meat, you had to kill something. It was as simple as that. So if you are a meat eater, it may be a useful exercise to do that. And if you're going to do it, St. Martin's Day is as good a time as any. But it really is so bound up in the agricultural cycle, and most of us don't live in the agricultural cycle anymore. We eat kiwis in January. You know what I mean? It's as far from this strong connection we have to the soil. So it really is up to you whether you want to do these things, you know, as a one-off, to see what it's like, to absorb the themes and the ideas, and to connect yourself to the idea of the agricultural year, themes of death and themes of subsistence, and all of these different ways that you can engage with it. But in terms of bringing it back, I can't see it happening in any meaningful way, because people don't keep their own animals, and they don't. A lot of squeamish meat eaters out there who just, you know, the burger arrives and they eat it kind of thing. You can observe folk traditions and customs and ideas, and I do it in a creative way with some of my other endeavors, but doing things for the sake of doing them will never really spread. Stuff has to have a resonance, it has to have a context in order to be meaningful. And you can do it on a personal level, and you can kill an animal on November 10th and watch the sunset and think about life and death and the meaning of it all. But if you want other people to do it, they have to have a meaningful reason for it. Otherwise, it's sort of revival for the sake of revival, which is fine in and of itself, but motivation and significance, and actually, you know, having some cultural hooks to hang it on, is what's important. And that's you know, that's how things survive, and that's how things die out. And it is tragic to see things die out that were old, but you know, we can be misty-eyed about it and think how wonderful it is, or we could live in the now as well and see what do we have left, what still resonates with us, what still rings a bell, and what can we use from the past that still has meaning for us, or can we mine the past for things that we can create and recreate for now and for the future. And like this Samhain festival is a great example of it. You know, there's lots of backward-looking and forward-looking things happening here. The parade, people want to come, they want to dress up, they want to engage in the parade because it's culturally meaningful, it's significant, and we draw the weight of the past with us when we do these things, but that gives us permission, and it gives us power, and it gives us motivation. But if we're just doing things for the sake of it, that's sort of like museum stuff, and culture is living. And festivals like this are a great example of living culture. So that's my thoughts on it. Any other questions? Yeah, one at the back. Yeah. Okay, so the question was the 9 nights and the night without counting. Is there any other connection with any other festivals? I am afraid I have no idea. I'm sorry, I know nothing about it. I guess I had the St. Martin's blinkers on. I never cast my net wider to see was there any significance in the 9. Why didn't they say 10 nights? Because it's 10, they're saying. 𝕻𝖌𝖎𝖈𝖊 has a lovely balance to it. And 9 is very often a sort of a magical kind of number in folk tradition, or a sort of a motif that's used. So maybe it's just for the balance of it, for the symmetry of it, for the fact that 9 is a motif yet in stories. But whether it has any other significance outside of that, I truly have no idea. So maybe it's one for the research. I'll go off and find out and see what I can find.
Billy, can I just, I'm introduced out to Kenny in the local church of St. Martin Tours. And my brother's actually called Martin's his second name, but I never ever came across that tradition. And my grandmother and her father would have lived there before and never came across it. And we would still do the May worship front door. That continued, but never the St. Martin.
Okay.
Knowing it was beside me, so to ask you, there's another St. Martin.
St. Martin de Porres.
Yes. And did you find any?
He's nothing to do with it. He's a Peruvian saint. He's much more recent, and he's nothing to do with it really. Look, I'll give you the back of the postcard explanation as to why it's not found in Cork, because you deserve it. It's to do with the calendars, something you mentioned earlier, the discrepancy between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar. So Pope Gregory noticed that the calendar was way out of whack, and he said the Julian calendar instituted by Julius Caesar, it was pretty good, but not quite good enough, and it didn't account for leap years and things like that. So eventually, by the 16th century, the calendar was quite out of whack, and midwinter wasn't happening when it was supposed to. And one of the biggest concerns that the Pope had was that they were celebrating Easter at the wrong time. All of their feast days, really, they're celebrating at the wrong time. So he gave a decree, and he said, we need to update the calendar. So we're going from, I forget what it was. For example, it was like we're going from April 1st to April 8th. Okay, something like that. We're just going to jump over all these days, and that will correct the discrepancy that's there. So this was a papal decree, and it went out, and most of Catholicism and Catholic countries played ball, but Britain wasn't going to be told by any pope when was when. So they held out, and they didn't institute this change. So in Ireland, for a while, you had Catholics observing one date, same day, but Catholics were observing one date and Protestants were observing a different date. The Battle of Kinsale was fought on 2 radically different dates, depending on which army you listen to. So for quite a while, for about 150 years I think it was, there was these 2 calendars going side by side, and the dates were completely different. And what you have in some instances is Irish Catholics writing to the Pope and saying, is it okay if we observe the Protestant calendar because we're trying to sell our cattle to them and they're holding fairs on the wrong day and all this kind of stuff. So we have these 2 systems going side by side. And in areas where Protestant culture held sway, you had Catholics observing the feast day of saints on one day and the fair associated with the feast days on another day. And there was a brief mention there of buying fowl and things like that, and Martinmas fairs happening. And what you have is Catholics observing St. Martin's Day on one night and then going to the Martinmas fair 10 days later. And therefore, that 10 is a coincidence, by the way. It's not really to do with Samhain. Park Samhain for a minute, and just focus on Martinmas. And any place where the economic and the agricultural on one side and the religious or the spiritual days were separated meant that both got so diluted that they passed from custom very quick. This happened in England on St. Michael's Day in particular, but you can see it in places where they divided the fair day from the religious observance. It meant that both got so weakened that the thing collapsed. And that explains why in most of Ulster, St. Martin's Day completely fell out of favour, because you had the feast, the religious day on one hand and the fairs on the other, and both became a thing and nothing so quickly that everybody forgot that Martinmas was ever a thing. And that seems to have been the case in Cork as well. So it was calendars and Protestants holding out, essentially, that meant the thing got diluted to the point where it got forgotten very, very quickly. So that's the short version of the explanation. But that's the best I could do. That's the best reason I could come up with for explaining why it was. And curiously enough, the same thing happened to 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 as well. 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙 is all but absent in Ulster and in Cork, and it's for the same reason. You had people observing the religious festival of Cromdo Sunday or Garland Sunday or that kind of thing, but the fairs that happened at 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙, things like Puck Fair, and the fair at Muff and stuff like that, in those areas where Protestant culture held sway, that died out very quickly as well. So it's a similar distribution pattern. Hiram Morgan from UCC knows quite a bit about this calendar discrepancy, and that's the person to ask really about it. But there you go. That's why Cork people know so little about it.
Was Cork particularly Protestant then?
Yeah, there was the calendar here seems to have lasted. The old Protestant reckoning of calendars seems to have held sway over Cork and some parts of South Kerry as well. Yeah, so there you are. Yes, are we done? Okay, folks, it's been a slice. 𝕻𝖆𝖈𝖙𝖎𝖈